"Get out of the vehicle now. Hands where I can see them." Officer Bradley Kowalski's voice cut through the night air like a blade, his service weapon drawn and pointed directly at the driver's side window. From inside the Tesla, a voice responded, calm, measured, but with an unmistakable tremor of controlled rage that came from a man who knew his world was about to be turned upside down. "Officers, I'm reaching for my registration. This is my car. I live here." But Kowalski wasn't listening. His adrenaline was pumping, his training was kicking in, and in his mind, he had caught a car thief red-handed. "Stop resisting. You're under arrest for grand theft auto," he screamed, as backup officers swarmed the vehicle like a tactical team responding to a terrorist threat. The sickening sound of handcuffs clicking into place echoed through the dashcam audio, followed by the harsh rip of expensive fabric as a designer suit, worth more than most people's monthly salary, tore against the rough asphalt of the driveway. The man being arrested wasn't fighting back, wasn't running, wasn't even raising his voice. He simply repeated, over and over, "This is my house. This is my car. I live here." But here's what made this story absolutely explosive. What happened next didn't just destroy careers. It brought down an entire police department, sent shockwaves through City Hall, and revealed a conspiracy so twisted that when the truth finally came out, the very police chief who had defended these officers ended up begging for mercy from the man they had arrested. And if you think you know where this story went, trust me, you have no idea what came next. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you think you know about justice, power, and what happens when the wrong person gets pushed too far. But before we dive into who this man really was and why his arrest triggered a chain of events that made national headlines, I need to ask you this. What would you do if you were arrested for stealing your own car in your own driveway? Would you stay calm, or would you fight back? Let me know in the comments below, because the man in that Tesla, his name was Julius Whitfield. And by the time that night was over, that name had been burned into the memory of every police officer, city official, and news reporter in the country. What they didn't know as they threw him into the back of that patrol car was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. They had just arrested a man with the power to end them all. So who exactly was Julius Whitfield? Because what you're about to learn will make what happened to him even more infuriating. Julius Whitfield is 38 years old, and he's not just successful. He's extraordinarily successful. He's the CEO and founder of Whitfield Technologies, a cybersecurity company that he built from absolutely nothing into a $2.3 billion empire. Let that sink in for a moment. $2.3 billion. That's not just rich money, that's change the world money. But Julius didn't inherit this wealth. He didn't get lucky with crypto or win the lottery. This man earned every single dollar through pure brilliance and relentless determination. After graduating from Stanford with his MBA, this former Marine captain started his company in his garage 12 years ago with nothing but a laptop, a dream, and an unshakable belief that he could revolutionize cybersecurity. And he was right. Julius lived in Millbrook Heights, the most exclusive neighborhood in the city, where the average home costs $3.2 million. And his neighbors were federal judges, Fortune 500 executives, and old money families whose names were on hospital wings. He earned his place there, house by house, contract by contract, building a company that now protects some of the most sensitive data in America. But success hadn't made Julius forget where he came from. Every morning after his workout, he would walk across his perfectly manicured backyard to the guest house where his 68-year-old mother, Eleanor, lived. She had moved in after suffering a stroke 2 years earlier, and Julius had converted the entire guest house into a fully accessible home for her recovery. Eleanor Whitfield had raised Julius as a single mother, working 3 jobs to put him through school, and now he made sure she wanted for nothing. The Tesla Model S Plaid sitting in his driveway wasn't just a car, it was a symbol. Julius had bought it as a gift to himself after landing the biggest government contract in his company's history, a $47 million deal to provide cybersecurity services to federal agencies. He had worked 18-hour days for 6 months to win that contract, competing against tech giants who had been in the game for decades. When he won, he walked into the Tesla dealership and paid cash for the most expensive model they had. That car represented everything Julius had achieved against impossible odds. On the evening that would change everything, Julius was returning from a board meeting downtown. It had been a long day, 12 hours of presentations, negotiations, and planning for the IPO that would cement his company's place among the tech elite. He was exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than checking on his mother and getting some sleep. As he made the familiar turn into his neighborhood, Julius noticed something in his rearview mirror that made his stomach tighten. An unmarked sedan had been following him for the last 10 minutes, staying exactly 3 car lengths behind, making every turn he made. His Marine training kicked in. This wasn't coincidence. Julius pulled into his own driveway, pressing the garage door remote as he had done thousands of times before. The familiar hum of the motor, the slow rise of the door, the motion sensors lighting up his perfectly organized garage. This was home. This was safety. This was his sanctuary. But as he sat in his driveway, something felt wrong. The unmarked car had disappeared, but Julius's instincts were screaming danger. And then, as if materializing from thin air, police cars appeared from every direction. Not 1 or 2, 5 patrol cars, their lights blazing, their sirens cutting through the night like war cries. Officer Bradley Kowalski emerged from the lead patrol car like he was responding to an armed robbery in progress. His service weapon was drawn, his face was flushed with adrenaline, and his voice carried the kind of aggressive authority that comes from a man who believes he's caught a dangerous criminal red-handed. Julius, drawing on his military training, immediately made himself as non-threatening as possible. Hands visible on the steering wheel, movements slow and deliberate, voice calm and respectful. He tried to explain that he was the homeowner, that this was his car, that there had been some kind of mistake, but Kowalski wasn't interested in explanations. "Save it for someone who believes your lies, boy," he snarled, the racial undertones so obvious it made Julius's jaw clench. That word, boy, delivered with such contempt, such dismissal, such casual racism, that it hung in the air like poison. Julius reached slowly for his wallet, producing his driver's license that clearly showed his name and the exact address where they were standing. The same address printed on his mortgage statements, his tax records, his voter registration, proof that this was, without question, his home. Kowalski barely glanced at the ID before dismissing it with a wave. "Fake ID won't save you. We got a report of a stolen vehicle, and you matched the description." From her bedroom window in the guest house, Mrs. Patricia Henley, the 74-year-old neighbor who had lived next door for 15 years, was recording everything on her phone. She had watched Julius come and go every day, had waved to him as he walked to check on his mother, had seen him working in his garden on weekends. She knew exactly who he was, and she was capturing every second of this outrageous injustice. Despite producing valid identification, despite explaining calmly and clearly that he was the homeowner, despite doing everything exactly right, Julius found himself being slammed against his own $130,000 car. The sound of his designer suit tearing against the metal was nothing compared to the sound of his dignity being shredded in front of his own home. And then, the moment that would haunt everyone involved forever, Eleanor Whitfield emerged from the guest house in her wheelchair. At 68 years old, still recovering from her stroke, Eleanor had heard the commotion and wheeled herself outside to see what was happening. When she saw her son, her brilliant, successful, honorable son, being brutalized by police officers in their own driveway, she began screaming with a mother's fury that could wake the dead. "That's my son. This is our home. What are you doing to my baby?" Officer Kowalski, instead of realizing the massive mistake he was making, doubled down on his aggression. "Ma'am, step back. This man is a dangerous criminal, and you need to stay away for your own safety." A dangerous criminal. Julius Whitfield, who had never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law, who had served his country as a Marine and built a company that employed over 2,000 people, was being labeled a dangerous criminal by a man who couldn't be bothered to verify a simple driver's license. The handcuffs clicked into place as neighbors began gathering. their phones out, recording the unthinkable scene of one of their most successful residents being arrested in his own driveway. Children pressed their faces against windows, watching in shock as a man they had seen coaching Little League and organizing neighborhood charity drives was thrown into the back of a patrol car like a common criminal. But the humiliation wasn't over. As Julius sat handcuffed in the patrol car, he watched in horror as officers began preparing to impound his Tesla, his car, from his driveway. The symbol of everything he had worked for was being hooked up to a tow truck while he sat powerless to stop it. Eleanor, who had already endured more stress than her recovering heart could handle, collapsed right there in her wheelchair. The sight of her son being arrested, the shock of seeing armed officers on their peaceful property, the sheer impossibility of what was happening, it was too much. Paramedics had to be called as Eleanor's blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels. Julius, sitting in the back of that patrol car, watched his elderly mother being loaded into an ambulance while his car was being stolen by the very people who had sworn to protect and serve. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Julius Whitfield's soul. The calm, diplomatic businessman was gone. In his place sat a man who had just realized that all his success, all his achievements, all his contributions to society meant nothing to the officers who saw only the color of his skin. The warrior was awakening, and when Julius Whitfield went to war, he didn't just win, he obliterated his enemies so completely that they begged for mercy. But he wasn't ready to show his hand yet. Not even close. The fluorescent lights of the police station interrogation room buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Julius Whitfield sat in handcuffs, still wearing his torn designer suit, still trying to process the nightmare that had become his reality. 6 hours had passed since his arrest, and he hadn't been allowed to make a phone call, hadn't been read his Miranda rights properly, and hadn't been given any explanation beyond suspected grand theft auto. Then Detective Sandra Mills walked in, and for a brief moment, Julius felt a flicker of hope. Mills was different from Kowalski. Where the arresting officer had been aggressive and dismissive, Mills seemed professional, even reasonable. She sat across from Julius with a neutral expression and opened a manila folder that Julius assumed contained the details of this massive misunderstanding. "Mr. Whitfield," she began, using his name for the first time all night, "I'm Detective Mills. I understand you're claiming this vehicle belongs to you?" Julius seized the opportunity to explain his identity calmly and rationally. He detailed his company, his address, his status in the community. He offered to call his lawyer, his assistant, anyone who could verify his identity within minutes. This was still fixable, he thought. This was still just a terrible mistake that reasonable people could resolve. Mills listened, taking notes, her expression unwritable. "We'll verify your story," she said finally. "But car theft is serious business, and we have to follow protocol." The phone call that would change everything came 20 minutes later. Mills contacted Julius's assistant, Rebecca Chapman, who had worked for him for 8 years and could verify every detail of his identity, his schedule, his ownership of the Tesla, everything. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Julius watched Mills's face as she hung up the phone. He saw the exact moment when realization hit her. The slight widening of her eyes, the barely perceptible tightening around her mouth, the way her shoulders sagged just a fraction. She knew. She knew they had arrested one of the most powerful men in the city for stealing his own car. But here's where the story takes a turn that will make you question everything you think you know about justice and accountability. Because instead of immediately releasing Julius with a profound apology, Mills's demeanor shifted. She was in too deep now, had invested too much in this arrest to back down gracefully. Her career, her reputation, her credibility, it was all on the line. That's when Captain Roy Henderson burst through the door, and Julius could see immediately that Henderson recognized the magnitude of the mistake. Henderson's face went pale as he looked at Julius, then at the file, then back at Julius. This wasn't just any citizen they had wrongfully arrested. This was Julius Whitfield, the man whose company had contracts with federal agencies, whose name appeared on charity gala guest lists with senators and federal judges. Henderson pulled Mills aside, and Julius could hear the urgent, whispered conversation. Handle this delicately. We need damage control, not more headlines. But it was too late for damage control because Julius's lawyer had arrived. Jennifer Park was a force of nature disguised as a 5'4" Korean-American attorney who had never lost a civil rights case. When she walked into that police station, the entire building seemed to vibrate with her fury. She had been Julius's legal counsel for 6 years, and she knew exactly what had happened the moment she got his call. "Where is my client?" she demanded, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned cops step aside. "And why has he been held for 6 hours without proper cause?" But here's where the corruption really started to show. As Jennifer began demanding answers, examining the arrest report, and requesting body camera footage, mysterious technical difficulties began occurring. The body camera footage from key moments of the arrest mysteriously malfunctioned. The audio was corrupted. The police report was filed with intentionally vague language that made Julius sound like a suspicious individual rather than a homeowner in his own driveway. After 6 hours of being treated like a criminal in his own city, Julius was finally released. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just charges pending investigation. A bureaucratic sword hanging over his head, designed to keep him quiet while they figured out how to spin this disaster. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Local news picked up the story within hours. Tech CEO arrested outside own home. The headline was deliberately understated, but the implications were explosive. By morning, Julius's phone was ringing non-stop with reporters, colleagues, and friends who couldn't believe what they were reading. Julius returned home to find his driveway marked with scuff marks where his Tesla had been dragged away by the tow truck. But worse than the property damage was the personal devastation. His mother, Eleanor, was in the hospital, her blood pressure dangerously elevated from the stress of watching her son's arrest. That night, Julius sat alone in his damaged suit in the same kitchen where he had started his day, reading financial reports and planning his company's future. But the man who sat there now was different. The diplomatic businessman was gone, replaced by someone much more dangerous. A strategic warrior with unlimited resources and nothing left to lose. He made 3 phone calls that night, and each one was a declaration of war. First call. His company's head of security, a former FBI agent named David Kim, who specialized in corporate espionage and criminal investigations. Second call. Thompson & Associates, the law firm that handled their government contracts and had connections that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Third call. His friend at the mayor's office, giving them one chance to make this right before he burned their entire system to the ground. By dawn, Julius Whitfield had assembled a team that would make the police department's worst nightmare look like a pleasant dream. What Julius discovered in the next 72 hours didn't just reveal corruption. It exposed a conspiracy so twisted that when the truth came out, it would destroy careers, end friendships, and send people to federal prison. Julius hired Thompson & Associates, the city's most feared civil rights law firm, the same firm that had taken down 3 police departments in neighboring cities and extracted tens of millions in settlements. When Thompson & Associates took a case, police chiefs started updating their resumes because heads were about to roll. The first breakthrough came from their private investigator, a former NSA analyst who could trace digital breadcrumbs that most people didn't even know existed. The anonymous tip that led to Julius's arrest? It wasn't anonymous at all. Phone records revealed the call came from a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store 3 miles from Julius's neighborhood. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed that Julius hadn't been followed randomly that night. Someone had been watching his routine, studying his patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or racial profiling gone wrong. This was a coordinated attack. The investigation revealed a web of corruption that reached deeper than anyone imagined. Officer Bradley Kowalski had a history of targeting successful black residents in upscale neighborhoods. 3 other incidents in the past 2 years, all hushed up with small settlements that kept the victims quiet and protected Kowalski's career. The pattern was unmistakable. Kowalski specifically went after black professionals who had achieved success in predominantly white spaces. Kowalski's social media revealed connections to extremist groups, posts about knowing your place, and coded language about protecting neighborhood values. This wasn't just racism. It was systematic intimidation designed to make successful minorities feel unwelcome in spaces they had earned the right to occupy. Detective Sandra Mills had her own motivations for going along with the arrest. She had been passed over for a promotion to lieutenant 6 months earlier when Julius's company was awarded the $50 million police technology contract. Mills had expected her husband's security firm to get that contract, and when Julius's superior technology and competitive pricing won the day, Mills took it personally. Captain Roy Henderson knew about Kowalski's pattern of targeting black residents but had done nothing to stop it. Internal emails showed Henderson repeatedly dismissing complaints, transferring investigators who asked too many questions, and protecting Kowalski from consequences. Henderson wasn't just complicit. He was actively enabling a racist officer to terrorize law-abiding citizens. But the real mastermind behind Julius's arrest was someone who had been hiding in plain sight. Security footage from the convenience store, where the burner phone was purchased, revealed the caller, James Thornfield, CEO of Thornfield Security Solutions and Julius's biggest competitor in the cybersecurity space. The same man who had lost the $50 million police contract to Julius's company 6 months earlier. Phone records showed that Thornfield had hired a private investigator to follow Julius, to learn his routines, to find a way to humiliate and discredit him. The anonymous tip wasn't random. It was revenge for losing the biggest contract in both companies' brat history. But here's the part that will make your blood boil. Thornfield assumed that a black man couldn't possibly be the real owner of such wealth. In his twisted worldview, Julius had to be a fraud, a criminal, someone who didn't belong in the same economic stratosphere. Thornfield was so blinded by his own racism that he genuinely believed he was doing the community a service by exposing what he saw as an obvious imposter. The private investigator's reports revealed the depth of Thornfield's obsession. He had Julius followed for weeks, photographing his house, his car, his daily routines. Thornfield was looking for any excuse to bring Julius down, and when he couldn't find evidence of actual wrongdoing, he decided to manufacture a crisis. If you think this story is unbelievable, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next when Julius unleashes his counterattack will leave you speechless. The revenge he orchestrates isn't just satisfying, it's absolutely devastating. But before we get to the justice part, I want to know, have you ever been profiled or discriminated against because of your race, your background, or your success? How did it make you feel? Drop your experiences in the comments below, because this story is bigger than just Julius. It's about all of us. The war was just beginning, and Julius Whitfield was about to show everyone what happens when you mess with the wrong person. While Julius was building his legal army and uncovering the conspiracy that had destroyed his life, something remarkable was happening in the rehabilitation wing of St. Mary's Medical Center. Eleanor Whitfield, 68 years old, and still recovering from her stroke, was pushing herself through physical therapy with a determination that amazed her doctors. But Eleanor wasn't just fighting to regain her strength, she was fighting for justice for her son. "I didn't raise my son to back down from bullies in uniform," she told her physical therapist as she struggled through her exercises, her voice shaking with a mother's righteous fury. "And I'll be damned if I'm going to let them get away with what they did to my baby." Eleanor had a secret that would change everything. From her bedroom window in the guest house, she had recorded the entire arrest on her phone. Not just the parts that the neighbors captured, not just the fragments that made it onto social media. The entire encounter, from the moment the police cars appeared until the moment they drove away with her son in handcuffs. And her footage contained something that would make your skin crawl. While the official police body camera footage had mysteriously malfunctioned during key moments, Eleanor's phone had captured everything in crystal clear audio. The racial slurs that Officer Kowalski muttered under his breath as he approached Julius's car. The disgusting comments about these people, that weren't caught on any other recording. The casual, conversational racism between officers who thought no one was listening. Eleanor's footage didn't just show police brutality. It exposed the kind of vile, systematic racism that officers thought they could hide behind their badges and their brotherhood of silence. When Eleanor was finally discharged from the hospital after 3 days, she made a decision that would trigger a media earthquake. She was going to make sure the world saw exactly what had happened to her son. The footage leaked to social media on a Wednesday morning at 9:17 a.m. By noon, it had been shared over 50,000 times. By evening, the view count had exceeded 2 million. By the next morning, Justice for Julius was trending nationally, and the video had been viewed over 15 million times. The audio was devastating. You could hear Kowalski's voice, clear as day, using language so vile and racist that news networks had to bleep out entire sentences. You could hear him laughing with other officers about putting this boy in his place. You could hear him discussing how they were going to teach him some respect. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest anymore. This was a hate crime caught on camera. Major news networks picked up the story with the fury of journalists who knew they had stumbled onto something massive. CNN led with it. MSNBC cleared their evening programming. Fox News found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to defend the indefensible. The story wasn't just trending on social media. It was dominating every news cycle in America. City officials went into full panic mode. Emergency meetings were called. Phone lines were jammed with calls from reporters, federal officials, and civil rights organizations. The mayor's office was flooded with protesters demanding immediate action. Police Chief Jake Lawrence called an emergency press conference, and you could see the sweat beading on his forehead as he approached the podium. Lawrence had been police chief for 12 years, had survived budget cuts and political scandals, but nothing had prepared him for this level of national scrutiny. The incidents captured in this video do not represent the values of our police department, Lawrence read from a prepared statement, his voice shaking slightly. We are conducting a full internal investigation and will take appropriate action. But it was too late for damage control, because the FBI had already seen Eleanor's footage. Within 48 hours of the video going viral, the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a civil rights investigation into the Julius Whitfield arrest. When the FBI gets involved in a local police matter, heads don't just roll, they disappear completely. Careers end. People go to federal prison. Entire departments get restructured. The FBI investigation moved with the efficiency of a federal machine designed to crush corruption. Internal Affairs, which had been dragging their feet on investigating Kowalski's pattern of misconduct, suddenly found themselves under federal oversight. Documents that had been buried were subpoenaed. Emails that officials thought were private were seized as evidence. And what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Officer Bradley Kowalski hadn't just cost the city Julius's settlement, he had cost them $2.3 million in payouts over the past 5 years. 7 different incidents, 7 different victims, 7 different cases where the city had quietly paid money to make Kowalski's racism disappear. The man was a walking lawsuit factory, and the department had been covering for him for years. Detective Sandra Mills found herself facing not just demotion, but possible criminal charges for filing false police reports. Federal prosecutors were examining her role in the cover-up, and her law enforcement career was effectively over. The woman who had thought she could intimidate Julius into silence was now facing federal felony charges. Captain Roy Henderson's email records revealed the full extent of his cover-up attempts. Messages to other supervisors about handling the situation quietly. Instructions to file reports with vague language. Orders to transfer investigators who asked too many questions about Kowalski's conduct. Henderson wasn't just complicit, he was the architect of the system that protected racist officers and silenced their victims. But the pressure wasn't just coming from federal investigators. Mayor Sarah Collins, who had been preparing to run for governor, suddenly found herself fighting for her political life. Protesters surrounded City Hall. Civil rights organizations called for her resignation. The national media was camping outside her office, demanding answers about how her administration had allowed this systematic racism to flourish. Collins, a Democrat who had built her career on promises of police reform and racial justice, was being exposed as someone who had turned a blind eye to the very corruption she claimed to oppose. Her political future was crumbling in real time, and she knew that her only chance of survival was to throw everyone else under the bus. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been flipped completely over. The officers who had humiliated Julius in his own driveway were now being humiliated on a national stage. The department that had tried to cover up their crimes was being dissected by federal investigators. The officials who had thought they could silence Julius with bureaucratic intimidation were now begging for mercy from the man they had wronged. But Julius wasn't interested in mercy. He was interested in justice. And what he was about to unleash would be so devastating, so complete, so utterly overwhelming, that when the dust settled, the entire power structure of the city would be unrecognizable. The warrior had been patient. The warrior had been strategic. Now it was time for the warrior to strike. The emergency city council meeting on Thursday evening was unlike anything the city had ever seen. The council chambers, which normally held maybe 50 people for routine budget discussions, was packed wall to wall with protesters, media crews, civil rights activists, and concerned citizens who had traveled from across the state to witness what everyone knew would be a historic moment. Outside, hundreds more protesters chanted, "Justice for Julius," while news vans lined the streets for 3 blocks in every direction. This wasn't just a local story anymore. This was a national reckoning with police racism that had captured the attention of the entire country. When Julius Whitfield walked into that council chamber, the room fell completely silent. This wasn't the same man who had been humiliated in his own driveway 2 weeks earlier. This was a warrior in a perfectly tailored suit, flanked by a legal team that had destroyed corrupt institutions across the country, carrying evidence that would obliterate everyone who had wronged him. Julius approached the podium with the calm confidence of a man who held all the cards. For 5 minutes, he delivered a speech that was so powerful, so devastating, so perfectly crafted that it would be replayed on news networks for months. 2 weeks ago, Julius began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. I was arrested for stealing my own car in my own driveway. But what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of harassment designed to intimidate successful minorities and remind us that no matter how much we achieve, no matter how much we contribute to this community, there are people in positions of power who will never see us as anything more than suspects. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing as Julius methodically dismantled the conspiracy piece by piece. He revealed Officer Kowalski's pattern of targeting black professionals. He exposed Detective Mills's personal vendetta over the lost contract. He detailed Captain Henderson's deliberate cover-up of racist misconduct. And then he delivered the bombshell that made several city council members visibly pale. Today, I am announcing a federal lawsuit against the city, Officer Bradley Kowalski, Detective Sandra Mills, and Captain Roy Henderson for violation of my civil rights, conspiracy, and deliberate indifference to a pattern of racist policing that has cost this city millions of dollars and destroyed the lives of innocent citizens. But Julius wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Police Chief Jake Lawrence, who was sitting in the front row, sweating profusely as he realized his entire career was about to end. I am also demanding the immediate resignation of Police Chief Jake Lawrence, who has overseen a department where racism flourishes and officers who abuse their power face no consequences. Lawrence stood up, his face red with anger and desperation, and made the biggest mistake of his life. My officers were following protocol, he declared, his voice shaking. Mr. Whitfield was acting suspiciously and in the interest of public safety. That's when Julius's legal team struck with the precision of a surgical knife. Jennifer Park, Julius's attorney, stood and presented evidence so overwhelming that Lawrence's words died in his throat. Security footage showing Thornfield purchasing the burner phone records proving the anonymous tip was part of a business conspiracy, audio recordings of Kowalski's racist statements, internal emails showing Henderson's cover-up attempts, financial records revealing $2.3 million in settlements to cover up Kowalski's previous crimes. Lawrence watched his entire world collapse in real time as the evidence mounted. Every lie he had told to protect his officers, every cover-up he had authorized, every victim he had silenced, it was all there, documented in excruciating detail. When Julius's team finished their presentation, Lawrence looked like a man who had just watched his own funeral. He realized his career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his only option was to try to negotiate some kind of dignified exit. "Please, I'm begging for mercy. Don't do this to us. Perhaps we could discuss a settlement," Lawrence said, sobbing. "Some kind of arrangement that could resolve this matter quietly." Julius looked at him with the cold contempt of a man who had been handcuffed in his own driveway and said 4 words that would echo through that chamber forever. "There will be no settlement." "I don't want your apology or sobs," Julius continued. "I want public accountability. I want justice, and I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Lawrence's resignation was announced 15 minutes later, effective immediately. But the justice was just beginning. Within 72 hours, Officer Bradley Kowalski was arrested on federal civil rights charges that could send him to prison for 20 years. Detective Sandra Mills was terminated and faced perjury charges for filing false police reports. Captain Roy Henderson was demoted to patrol officer and transferred to the night shift in the worst precinct in the city. James Thornfield, the tech executive who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, was charged with filing false police reports, harassment, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. His company lost all government contracts, and he faced both criminal prosecution and a civil lawsuit that would bankrupt him completely. Julius's company was awarded additional government contracts worth $75 million, recognition of both his integrity and the superior quality of his cybersecurity technology. But Julius wasn't satisfied with just winning. He wanted to transform the entire system. He was appointed to the newly created City Police Oversight Committee, giving him direct authority over police misconduct investigations. New policies were implemented to prevent racial profiling, with mandatory bias training for all officers and automatic federal reporting of any complaints involving racial discrimination. The city's police body cameras were upgraded to tamper-proof technology developed by Julius's company, ensuring that future incidents couldn't be covered up with convenient malfunctions. The new system uploaded footage directly to federal servers, making it impossible for local officials to suppress evidence. Eleanor Whitfield, fully recovered from her stroke and energized by her role in exposing the corruption, became a powerful advocate for elderly victims of police misconduct. She testified before Congress about the trauma experienced by families who witnessed police brutality, and her advocacy led to new protections for vulnerable populations. Julius established the Eleanor Whitfield Scholarship Fund for minority law students, providing full tuition for students committed to civil rights law. The first class of recipients included 12 students who would go on to become the next generation of civil rights attorneys. 6 months after his arrest, Julius was driving the same Tesla Model S Plaid through the same neighborhood where his nightmare had begun. But everything was different now. The new police chief, Maria Rodriguez, personally apologized to Julius at a community meeting and committed to rebuilding trust between the police and the community. Mrs. Patricia Henley, the neighbor who had recorded the arrest from her window, hung a sign in her yard that read, "Justice served, never again." As Julius pulled into his driveway, he saw his mother Eleanor, fully recovered and stronger than ever, waving to him from the front porch. The scuff marks from the tow truck were gone, but the memory of what had happened there would never fade. Sometimes justice isn't just about winning. It's about making sure it never happens to anyone else. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.